Hi, welcome to our first AMA. I'm Co Hendricks, head brewer at MiniBrew, and we want to give you the chance to ask some questions about the MiniBrew system and how to brew beers at home. At the end of the session, I will have a few gifts for you for new and existing customers. It's just a little thank you for helping us out with our first AMA session. First, I want to give you all a cheers. I'm having a really nice white sip with curcuma and cardamom. It's awesome. So, cheers to you. And let's dive into it. Um, the first question. The first question is from Alan Carter, and he asks, "Please, can you advise on the various temperature changes for mashing and fermentation to include dry hopping?" He added, "Some recipes have different temperature steps for mashing, but are not using wheat, just barley. Is this good practice, please?" This is a complex question because there are two major things in this one. One is the mashing. Mashing is converting the grains into sugars, and we have fermentation, which is converting the sugars into CO2 and alcohol. So I'm going to split this answer up in these two. And I think the best way to do this, I give you a screen share, and I will go first to the mashing. This is the standard we use for our mashing, and in the end, what is the effect of different mashing temperatures? That's you want to have a different type of body. So if you want to have a light bodied beer, you use lower temperature than when you are brewing a full body beer. Like we use for like a barley only recipe, we use for a light body 60 degrees Celsius temperature for 75 minutes, and then we raise it to 78 degrees for 5 minutes as a mash out. But if you go for more a fuller body, then we go to 69 degrees and we leave it only for 45 minutes, and then we do again a mash out at 78 degrees. What Alan already stated is this is for barley recipes, barley based malts. If you use unmalted malts, then you could use as well. You have to use a more complex mashing scheme again for light-bodied and full-bodied beers. And if you want to have like more wheat aroma, then even the mashing schemes become more complex. But always the general rule stays that if you want to have a light-bodied beer, you keep it at the lower temperatures. If you want to have a full-bodied beer, you mash at higher temperatures. And if you only use barley malts, then I suggest to keep it very simple because nowadays most malts are so advanced that with a simple one-step, or in this case two-step mashing scheme, you already will get a lot of sugars extracted from your malt, and it's not necessary to go into very complex mashing schemes. I hope this will answer your question about mashing. If you have about fermentation, fermentation is quite a complex part as well, because fermentation, then you introduce a new animal, or you introduce a yeast into your beer, and yeast is a living creature, living organism. And every living organism has its optimal living temperature, and it's dependent on the yeast as well. So you see, for every yeast, we use a different fermentation temperature. But if I go to the one of the most general yeast used, dry yeast used, is the Safale US05, as you can see here. Well, the optimal fermentation range for this beer is 23 degrees. And we keep that one for 8 till 9 days. Then we're pretty much sure that all the sugars are converted into CO2 and alcohol. Then we go to conditioning, and conditioning in our system means that we remove the trop from the keg, so everything is settled to the bottom, and you make sure that the yeast cake is removed from the beer. That's why we put this at 0 days. So after these 0 days, so after this time, the primary is done, airlock is removed, and the trop container is removed from the keg too. Then we still leave it for 5 days again on the same temperature, just to make sure that all the sugars are converted. And then we drop the temperature to 5 degrees to make sure that all the sediments are settled down to the bottom. And then we remove the yeast again in this conditioning step. If you want to add dry hop, in most cases this is done in the secondary. And you see here, this is pretty much the same temperature and time as you can see here in the normal. The conditioning again to remove the yeast cake. And then we normally keep it at 23 degrees for 2 days, and then we add the dry hop, in this case 20 grams. The only thing that you have to take into consideration when you are doing the dry hop, that's that you have to set multiple conditioning steps to make sure that all the hop is removed from the beer, because hop in the beer, it doesn't give a good flavor to it because you want to drink beer, not hoppy water. But as well, you want to make sure that your tap line doesn't get clogged. So we suggest for every 10 grams of hop that you at least do one conditioning step. And in this recipe in standard, we do one extra to make sure that all the proteins and all the other parts are removed from the beer too. So hopefully this answers your question. Well, first I take another sip of my delicious beer. From Art Bogart, we got a question via Facebook, and he says, where do I get the values when adding a custom ingredient? In the MiniBrew portal, we have programmed a lot of ingredients already with preset standards, but in some cases you want to use your own ingredients. So that's why we have the option to put your own ingredients in there. For instance, a grain. But there are some values maybe you do not know. So I can show you. Do the share screen again. So this is my personal portal environment, and if I want to make a beer, I can add. I go to the beers, and I have here my session season, which I made in the previous video. And you see here all standard malts in here. But maybe I want to add another malt. So I can do that. Just edit the recipe. And I just have to wait. And I add a fermentable. And here you can see all the standards. But maybe I want to add something else. I grew my own malts in my garden. I found a supplier, I don't know. And I can add my own ingredients. I can give it the name, for instance, Co's malt. It's a grain. Oh, not an extract. It's a grain. It requires mashing. And then the difficult question comes: dry yield. What does dry yield mean? Dry yield means how much sugar can be extracted from the malt, and that depends on the malt supplier that you have. I have prepared a bit for this, like we have for the Swan. And Swan malts like this Vienna malt, you can see what is the characteristics of the beer, and here you can see that this has an extract of 80. So in our recipe, we put as well 80. If I would put 50 in here, that would mean that that the software will calculate less sugar extraction, which means that your original gravity of the beer will be different than you expect. So therefore it's important that you look this up. And as well, moisture, that's also, you can find that's the amount of moisture in the malt. In general it's 5%, but this can change a little bit on how you store it, but this is also in most cases presented by the supplier. You have the same thing for yeast, and for yeast it's mostly important because yeast has one major important part, and I'm going to add my own yeast as well, because I can add my ingredient as a yeast. I can call it Co's yeast. It's a dry yeast, and then the difficult question comes: what is attenuation? Well, attenuation is the ability of a yeast to convert sugars into CO2 and alcohol. So if you have a high attenuative yeast, it means that the yeast can convert pretty much all the sugars into alcohol. If you have a low attenuative yeast, this means that a lot of the sugars will not be converted into CO2 and alcohol, which result in a lower alcohol level of the beer and more residual sweetness in the beer. This is also you can find at the supplier. Here I have Fermentus, the USO5, this is our standard yeast. And here you can see as well the apparent attenuation, because they always are displaying this, is 81%. So if I fill in 81%, our software will calculate as well what the final gravity of the beer will be. So that, which is presented here, so which relates to the beer. So if you have a lower attenuated beer, this final gravity will be higher, which also means that the ABV level of the beer will be lower. Yeah, Art, hopefully this answers your question. Otherwise, I will probably see this question, more questions pop up. So I'll go back to this one. Chris Haynes. Here's a long question. It is, to convert recipes, is it just convert the volume from 20 liters to 5.5 and adapt everything accordingly? Or is there more science to be considered? There is a little bit more science to be considered. If I share my screen again, I see, I have to do this one. If we go back to the session season, the recipe I just showed you, if I want to convert it from 20 liters to 5.5, it's important that you always take into consideration for the malts, that you take into consideration what the original gravity is, because in the end, that's the goal of your recipe, to reach a certain level of original gravity. And as well that you keep into consideration that the balance between the three malts is the same. So for instance, this beer has an original gravity of 1047. If I want to raise it, it's very easy for me to say, hey, I just make the pale malt, I increase it from 1200 grams to 1500 grams. And you see that the original gravity is now 1053. So for the gravity is okay, but what you can see as well, that the balance becomes totally different. The pale malt becomes way more dominant in the balance than the Vienna and the oats. So if I would do this right, I'm not only raising the pale malt, but in the same ratio, I'm adding as well Vienna malt and oats, flaked oats, to keep the same balance level. So these two figures are very important to keep into consideration when scaling it up or down a recipe as well. But the mashing temperatures, you don't have to think about that, because in general you can use the same things. For hops, also our system calculates the IBU, and IBU is the bitterness of the beer. This beer has a bitterness of 24 IBU, and it's calculated based on our system settings. So when you make a beer and you add hops, make sure that you keep in mind that the IBU level is in the desired range of your original recipe as well, and then keep the balance of the different types of hops that you use in the same way. Boil time and addition times, you can pretty much do the same thing. And for fermentation, well, yeah, the only thing that you have to keep in mind is that you really have to set a time for the conditioning. So when are you removing the yeast or the drop from the beer? And the temperatures, yeah, those are optimal for a yeast, so that's not specific for our system. So hopefully this answers your question. Then I get a question from Stefan Brauner. And he asked the question, I've seen people use a hop spider, especially with heavy dry hopping. I'm also getting one. Is there anything I need to change, take into account when creating a recipe when I use a hop spider? Yeah, well, for the people that don't know, a hop spider is a tube with perforated steel in which you can put hops, and you can put this into the keg. And the advantage of the system is that when you are dry hopping, you can remove this tube directly from your wort. Then pretty much all the hops are removed from your wort, instead of what we have in this recipe, which I just showed you, that you have to do the truck removals all the time to make sure that all the hops are removed from the beer. Um, well, what you have to take into consideration when you do this, I think one of the things is again the efficiency, because with the standard dry hop, you pour the hops into the keg, which means that the hops can freely float and will settle down to the bottom at some point when they are done. With a tube, it could be that it's so full that it cannot freely float anymore, and that's why hop extraction will be different or could be different. If this is not the case, the only difference is that you do not have to add as much conditioning steps in the fermentation, because you can remove all the trup at once, and then you only have to do one or two to remove some particles and some proteins and yeast residuals from your beer. So Stefan, I hope this answers your question. Um, well, a lot of questions are coming in. I see now one from Juan Carlos. He asked about, he never tried a double mash recipe. Is there anything I need to know before I create a recipe? Um, well, one of the things is double mashing is that you do multiple mashes. That you do a standard mash. You remove the malts, pour a new malt in the mash tun, you place it back, and then you mash again. The advantage of this is that you can get all grain recipes with a way higher original gravity, which in the end will result in a higher alcohol and a more thick beer. For instance, the brew packs, the Sputnik and the Bonfire that we have in our platform, those two are also double mashed beers. That's why they are heavy and thick, and still heavy, but without adding some sugars, some simple sugars during fermentation. I can show you. I can show you the um, the how you can set a double mash. Like for instance, in this case, we have a mashing with the same recipe, and I can add a mashing stage. And you see here, we get exactly the same information, same setup as we had before. So I could set here the same pale Vienna oats, flaked oats, but and this is quite a standard practice to do. You get a lot of sugar extraction, and you just do two times the same mash. This is simple with weighing, because you just only have to weigh off one batch of grain, and you just pour them in, split it in two, and then you pour them in. But what you also could do is that you first add the malts that you want to get sugars out, and in the second mash you fill it up with also the dark malts, the malts that give a lot of flavor, so that you're sure that you get the maximum extraction of the sugar, and that the mashing can be optimal, and that the flavored malts like chocolate malts do not stay too long in the beer. I'm hoping that this answers your question too, Juan. Then I got a question from Shrimp with double I brewer. He asked, "My beers are hardly carbonating. Any recommendations apart from the ones that the app shows?" Carbonation is a complex process as well, and what is important in the end, carbonation is that pressure builds up into a keg. So if you want to carbonate your beer, you have to be sure that the keg is always 100% closed and gas is not able to escape. Well, gas can escape in a few ways. If you do not close the lid well enough, or if you leave the tap on and some gases erupt from there, or you leave the CO2 connector on it, but when the screw is not connected very well. This could result that some gas leaks out, and then you get undercarbonated beers. So if you want to carbonate your beers, make sure that you take plenty of time to carbonate. So put pressure on it, put it at a low temperature, as low as possible, and then leave it for at least 2 days. And then just try if it's carbonated. If it's not carbonated and your CO2 cartridge is empty, just add another cartridge. But in general, one CO2 cartridge should be sufficient to carbonate your beers. And make sure that you are not leaking any gas, because every leak gas is not anymore in your beer. You can compare it with a Coke bottle. Once you open it and you do not put any gas in it, after a week all the fizz is gone. Then I get a question from Richard Hallebeek. First I have to take another sip, of course. And his question is, what do I do when I want to add more than 6 hop drops? Well, if you know the MiniBrew system has 6 hop containers on top of the system, which all can at some point can drop the hops. Right now, every hop addition is 1 hop drop, which means that if you want to add more hops, in general, it's the best idea to make a custom ingredient for this. So what I always call it is a hops melange, for instance. I just name a beer a hops melange, and I take the average of the alpha acids that I want to add at that moment and the total amount I want to add. The max amount of the hops that you want to put into one tube or in the one hop compartment is always 12 grams, but you can say, well, I want to put 6 grams of Citra, 6 grams of Amarillo in there, for instance. And but if you call it hops melange, then it's possible to add multiple hops in one hop carousel position. Our developers are working quite hard on it to make this more simple, so that we are not using this approach anymore. So in the near future, you're able to set more ingredients into one hop compartment. But until then, use a hops melange approach, and then pretty soon you will see some improvement on that case. Richard, I hope this answered your question. Then I get a question from Arthur, and he asks, dry yield, is it the same as extract percentages or extract fine grind dry bases? Well, our system can only use coarse grind when answering this question. So dry yield in general is the number that's always presented with the malt. So hopefully this answers your question, Arthur. And then I get a question as well from Marco Mamoli. I want to know how to set a recipe for a kettle sour or a Berliner Weisse. That's an awesome question, because I love those beers too. Well, for the people that do not know a kettle sour or a Berliner Weisse, those beers consist of 2 types of fermentation. First, you have a lactic acidic fermentation, followed up by in a normal procedure by a boil, and to make sure that the lactic acid, the bacteria are gone. And then you add a normal yeast to make sure that the sugars are fermented into CO2 and alcohol like in a normal beer. This results in a beer that's way more sour and becomes very fresh, and especially for summer, it's a really enjoyable beer. Our system is not able to go from to the boil in the middle, but what we found out in practical tests is that if you add lactic acid, like for instance the Lallemand sour pitch, you add it in the fermentation. After 1 day, pretty much the pH level is already dropped significantly, and then the lactic acid doesn't do anything anymore. If you then add the yeast without boiling the wort in the middle, the yeast will pick it up, and then it will ferment it perfectly out as a normal beer, and then you have a really nice sour as a beer. So then the boil is not required, and I'm pretty big fan of the beer that we developed. It's really nice to make such a sour beer. Um, it's I can show you how we can do it in the software as well, because you can add more multiple yeast. I go back to my share screen. Um, oh, because what I normally do is, if I do this kind of fermentation, I can put here. I'm hoping that the sour pitch amount sour pitch is in there. No. Well, then I'm just adding the sour pitch. It's dry yeast. Attenuation is I don't know. Let's say I think it's 0 because it doesn't attenuate very much. It's Lallemant. And product ID I don't know right now. I just call it sour. And this one I keep at a high temperature. I want to do it at 30 degrees for 1 day. And then what I do, I add a primary fermentation step, which is now here, to move it up a bit. And now I can add a standard USO5 as a yeast, and 3 grams of this. And then now here I can do my standard fermentation like I would do normally. So it's perfectly okay. So you're perfectly able to make a sour pitch. Only the boil in the middle is not possible, but in my opinion, it's not really required. I get a question from Marco. Sorry, hopefully I answered your question correctly. If you have any more questions, just drop them. I see a question from Chris Hannes, and he asked, so far I use regular tap water, which is in my region extremely hard. Is this influencing my beer drastically? What can I do to correct it? And Alan Carter is also asking a similar question about treating bottled water. Yeah, hard water, that's definitely a thing that you can work on. It's more like an advanced step, but it definitely will have a positive effect on the beer. What you have to take into consideration, if you want to make a lager or a German lager, then try to mimic the beer from Germany, the water from Germany in this beer. If you want to make a Belgian beer, then you have to mimic the water quality of the Belgian region, and that's always playing around with pH levels and minerals. But it definitely has an effect on the beer, and this will definitely will change the flavor and how a beer will taste. But it's if you're not able to do so, then it's not a problem at all to just use normal water without any changes to it. I've seen one. Well, oh, this is already because it's already 6 o'clock. Time is flying. I was a bit. I didn't expect it would go this fast. Because I would like to thank you all for. I would like to thank you all for coming. And we have some codes for you to get some discount. I try to put them on right now. So if you use the discount code Happy Brewing, you get in our web shop at minibrew.io, get 3 months free portal trial, so you can make your own recipes, and you get €200 off the MiniBrew craft. So you can brew a lot. I can imagine if you already have a MiniBrew, and a lot of people in this live feed already have. We also have something for you. Because if you when you renew your portal access, use the code 90 days of brewing, and also you will get 3 months free access to the brewery portal extra to your account set. So hopefully I answered all your questions. And if you have any more questions, I think pretty soon we will do another AMA session. And if you liked it, and please enjoy good beer. Cheers!